We'd like to welcome everyone to the BYU Redd Center for Western Studies Annaley Naegle Redd Lecture. We're particularly grateful for the Redd family and the Butler Peters and Clarence Dixon Taylor and all of the families that have been part of the Redd Center for so many years. Thank you for being with us. We welcome the students and those joining us online. My name is Jay Buckley. I'm the director of the center, and I'll do a little introduction of the named lecture itself, and then our office supervisor, Amy Carlin, will offer the invocation, after which my colleague, Brendan Rensnick, will introduce our speaker. Annaley Naegle Redd was a prominent southeastern Utah rancher and philanthropist and the wife of Charlie, or Charles Redd. Annaley was born in the Mormon colonies in Mexico in 1910. Her family was forced to flee Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. Once back in the United States, her father provided no material nor emotional support to Annaley and her mother, a plural wife, even though their families lived in the same town. Despite economic hardships, Annaley graduated from high school and completed a normal school education degree at Brigham Young Academy. Annaley taught school at LaSalle, Utah, where she met and married Charles Redd in 1931. She worked as a partner in his LaSalle Livestock Company, a precursor to the Redd Ranches, including duties as cook, storekeeper, and secretary. When bankers came to foreclose on the ranch during the Great Depression, Annaley's famous cooking, especially her prairie fire beans, helped save the ranch. Charlie suffered a stroke in 1972, and Annaley cared for him until his death in 1976. She had a deep love of family and history. She and Charlie raised 8 children. Annaley purchased her family home, a historic winery in Tokerville, and restored it. She belonged to numerous literary clubs and enjoyed reading, and passed away in August of 2000. And even though I'm not introducing the speaker, I was interested to do just a little foreword, and it's only appropriate since Elliott did the foreword for my first book back in 2006, and he did the book blurb for my last book, which came out 2 months ago. So he's been bookends for my career. I'm just very grateful for his generosity and graciousness. We also just learned, and I'll steal a little bit of thunder, that his new book, Continental Reckoning, was announced 2 hours ago on the New York Times as the winner of the Bancroft Award for the best book in American history. Well, this will be his first public address since winning this National Book Award. So, Amy.
You are going to hear from Elliott West at some point, I promise. We are truly honored today to be joined by one of the most respected historians of the American West over the past many decades, Elliott West, Emeritus, Alumni, Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Arkansas. He may blush and self-deprecate at such a claim of him being one of the most respected historians, but for anyone who's been online where I was posting about the lecture, there was numerous comments that came in and numerous direct messages to me that came in of people telling me their experiences with Elliott West, not just that he's an amazing historian, but that he is unassuming and humble and gracious and generous, which I think we need a lot more of in this world. So we're fortunate to have him here for many reasons. Professor West earned his bachelor's degree from UT Austin and an MA and PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder. He was then an assistant and associate professor of history at the University of Texas at Arlington for 8 years before taking his post at the University of Arkansas, where he remained until his recent retirement. In addition to publishing some nearly 50 academic articles, 25 book chapters, editing 3 anthologies, he is also the author of 8 monographs, starting with his first in 1979, The Saloon on the Rocky Mountain Mining Frontier. That would be a spicy topic for BYU. I'm not going to list out all 8 books. I will note specifically his 1998 book, The Contested Plains, Indians, Gold Seekers, and the Rush to Colorado, which for a few generations of graduate students working on the American West, this has become a standard text that many of us had to read. It also won multiple awards, Best Book Awards from the American Society of Environmental History, the Organization of American Historians, the Society of American Historians, Western History Association, and even the Best Historical Nonfiction Book from the Western Writers of America. And I probably should personally apologize to him for any harm caused in diminishing the prestige of that award when I won it 20 years later. So apologies. But back to his books. The most recent, as Jay just noted, Continental Reckoning, The American West in the Age of Expansion, published last year, where he'll be drawing from for his talk today. Amazingly, just 2 hours ago, won the Bancroft Prize, which for those who are not aware, this is the biggest national history book award in the United States. So it's really, really amazing. So congrats to Elliott again on that. And join me in welcoming Professor Elliott West.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is this working, Brendan? Okay, great. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank all of you for being here. Thanks certainly to the Redd Center for the invitation and my gratitude to the Redd family. It's great to be here. Brendan mentioned that I went to grad school at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And the first time I visited here at Provo, I thought this might be the only university campus except Boulder that has a more beautiful setting. It's really kind of stunning, you know, when you come here. And I've been here a few times and loved it each time. So in any case, thank you again. Thank you again for the invitation. Thank to all of you certainly for coming. As Brendan said, I was asked when I was asked to come here. I was asked to talk a bit about this new book that came out about a little more than a year ago. It's a book that took 25 years to research and write. My main feeling about the book is I'm really glad that it's out and it's over. The research and writing is over. It was a little bit exhausting, but it's one that I learned a lot in particular, regarding the question of where American expansion and the birth of the American West, that's what the book is really about, where the birth of the American West fits in the larger narrative of American history. What did it mean, you know, for us to expand to the Pacific as rapidly as we did, and then for that area, this new part of the country, the new republic, to be organized and to become the region that we all know as the American West, the region we all love, I assume, that we call the American West. And that's what I want to focus on today. Let's begin with the basics. Expansion. What are we talking about with American expansion in the 1840s? You see here in the map, starting with Texas down there at the bottom, 1845. Then in 1846, up in the Pacific Northwest, treaty with England. And then in 1846, we go to war with Mexico and acquire that third part, you see down there, the Mexican cession. Add those all up. And the United States, in less than 3 years, added 1,200,000 square miles to its borders. That's a little bit less than 750 million, with a B, 750 million acres in about 28 months and 15 days. It's a lot of land. It's a lot of land. If you want to try to put that in perspective, I figured this out. Imagine that between now, today, and August the 17th, 2026, the United States will expand, not to the west, can't do that, we get wet, but to the south. If we should expand to the south by that time, then August 17th, 2026, we would include, our borders would now include Mexico, Honduras, Nicaragua, Belize, all of Mexico, all of Central America, and 1/2 of the country of Colombia in less than 3 years. Now that seems to me to be one of the most important and revealing and consequential developments in American history. How do you argue otherwise, right? And yet I think it's been given too little attention especially in regard to putting it in the context of what was going on largely in this country, more widely in this country. And look what happens then. This is a map by a French cartographer in 1846 that shows the far west. Of course, that line down through the middle of it is the Sierra Nevada. We're over there at the far right. This is 1846. If you look more closely at this, you will see that this part of the North American continent, or become the United States, was this hodgepodge, this tossed salad of cultures and power and centers of authority. It was just this jumble of different cultures. 30 years later, half and again of a normal lifetime, it would be this: the United States that we know today. It would be organized politically into states and territories. There would be an established system of power. It would be economically transformed and become, as I'll mention in a moment, a great economic engine in this country. There would be a racial order that was not there before. It would, in other words, be environmentally almost completely made over. It was this incredible transformation of something like 1/2 of the current United States into something new. This enormous transformation, which is the creation of the American West. So what I've tried to do in this book is really two things. First, I've tried to tell that story. That is simply to narrate the story of the birth of the West. How did that happen? What were the details of it? Or the forces behind it? But secondly, and as I researched the book, I became more and more focused on this question. Secondly, what did that mean for the United States? What did it mean? And I came to believe that this was one of the two great events of the middle of the 19th century that made this country over. One of the few things that American historians can agree on, they argue usually about everything, one of the few things that they agree on is that in the middle of the 19th century, roughly, something really important happens. And that important thing is the narrative of American history, our national story, shifts. It's always changing, of course, but there's this sort of a fundamental movement shifting of the story onto a trajectory that will carry us into what we know as modern America. Modern America, the United States of the 20th century and now the 21st century. Fundamentally different country from the one that we saw before, let's say 1850. It becomes a new nation, transformed. How? What I argue here is that there were two events that produce that. The usual suspect that you see, that historians focus on, is the American Civil War. And of course, it's enormously important, hugely important in this. But what I suggest here is that there are two events that have to be recognized, two of them, and then we need to think about how those two events bounced off each other. There's expansion to the Pacific, and then there's the Civil War. They're interrelated. They are like historical twins. And like many twins, you really can't understand one without the other. So what I'm suggesting here in the title Continental Reckoning is that we look at American history during these critical years truly continentally. Step back, broaden the lens and look at what's going on in the United States between around 1850 and around 1880. And ask yourself, how does that help us understand how we came to be who we are today, this modern nation. And I think when you do that, I think you've got to bring the American expansion and the American West, the birth of the West, up to center stage, along with the Civil War. It's those two things together, really. Let me explain. Well, think about this, but here's sort of a thought experiment. This will be just for all of you this morning. Ask yourself, What do we mean by modern America? What are the defining traits of the United States in the 20th century and the 21st century that distinguish it from the United States, let's say, before 1850? We'll all recognize, of course, that it's very different. But how? How is it different? What do we mean by modern America? And then secondly, I'd like you to ask yourself, once you come up with a list, ask yourself, to what degree, if any, did the birth of the American West explain that story, explain those differences? How does the birth of the West help us understand how we came to be the nation with those bullet points that you have the defining modern America? What were they? That's what I want to focus on today. Not so much the birth of the West per se, but what kind of a difference that it made. Let me make 3 points. Historians always make 3 points. They never make 2 points. They never make 4 points. They always make 3 points. My 3 points here. We are, this nation today, without competition, the most powerful economy on earth in history, in human history. We're the richest. We're the most powerful. A lot of concern you hear today about how we're being challenged by other nations, China in particular. But we're still the 800-pound gorilla. For example, sort of the fundamental measure that historians use, economists use, to judge this question is the GDP, the gross national product. The United States GDP is greater than the next 4 combined. Greater than adding China, Japan, Germany. We're the economic giant of the world, economic giant of history. How did it happen? How did it happen? Let's begin. And how did the West have any consequence for that? Let's begin with what I call the great coincidence. What I think is without contest the greatest coincidence in American history. The last act of expansion was the war with Mexico, which ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in a suburb of Mexico City, where this man on the left, Nicholas Trist, signed a treaty with Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. He signed that on February the 2nd, 1848. 9 days before that, in Northern California along the American River. That's about 200 hours, 200 hours before we officially acquire the Mexican concession. This guy on the left, this sort of happy-go-lucky, loosey-goosey character on the left there, James Marshall, looked down. He was in charge of building a mill on the American River. And he looked down and he saw something shiny. And he picked it up, and it was, of course, gold, worth about 50 cents. This began what was by far the most productive, wealthiest gold rush in human history up until that time. Give you some idea of this. How much gold is produced? More gold was produced in California. Also with Australia, there was a discovery in Australia soon after that. Between 1848 and 1858, that had been produced across the world from 1492 to 1848. More gold was produced in California alone, in 1 year alone, 1852, than had been produced in all of the 18th century across the world. Give you a more tactile idea of what we're talking about here. The head of the mint in San Francisco, which was established in 1855, reported that so much gold was being produced, was being turned into bars in the mint, that the furnaces couldn't handle it, and they blew gold dust out of the chimneys. So they had to send people around to the rooftops around the mint to sweep up the gold because they couldn't process it. That's a lot of gold. And when did this come? So this is being produced now, starting around 1850, just at that time when the United States is retooling into this new economy, is building, the infrastructure of this modern American nation. When we're moving to the cities, when we're building factories, when we're transforming the economy, just at that moment, gold is discovered, and it is followed, as you'll see on this map, it's followed by gold rushes. It sets in motion a series of gold rushes across the nation, into Canada, across the world. So at the very time that we needed it, the West gave us the wealth that we required to rebuild, to become the modern America. And this was followed by others. And what starts with gold? 10 years after Marshall's discovery, just over the Sierra in Nevada, they discover what was at the time the richest single silver strike in human history, apart from one down in Mexico. Silver strikes in up here, across the West, of course. Well, once you begin to build this new economy, what do you need then? Well, in a modern industrial economy, the most important, the most valuable non-precious metal is copper. Copper for the machinery, copper for the telegraph, copper for the rest. That's what we needed desperately in these years. And sure enough, we look around, there it is. The United States during these, Western United States during these years was by far the greatest producer of copper in the world, with discoveries up at the Northern Plains, discoveries in Montana, Butte, Montana, discoveries out in Arizona. So it's as if fate asks us, what do you need? And we say, we need this, and they point to the West. There it is. You got it. Now, as we rebuild this economy, rebuild this society, we need to literally build the infrastructure. And while we're moving into the age of iron and steel, we're still in the age of wood. The factories are built by wood. The homes in these new expanding cities are built with wood. Mining in the mines in California and the Comstock lode require a lot of wood down below. The Comstock lode, if you put together all the wood needed to construct the Comstock lode below the earth, it would be enough wood to build ranch-style houses for a city of 50,000 people. All of it below ground. Telegraph, you need wood. The railroad, you need wood. Well, we had wood. Go to the Pacific Northwest, one of the most productive forest areas or lumbering areas on Earth. You need it, we got it. And this shows up in the oddest, most unexpected places. This whole theme of the West providing the raw materials for the making of a new nation. For instance, we're all aware of the great slaughter of the bison in the West. How did it happen? Well, it begins earlier, back in the 1820s, with the production of bison robes and so forth. But then in 1870, it was a very precise point. In 1872, the bison population on the plains, which had dropped by maybe half, just falls off the cliff. 10 years later, there are maybe 1,000 left, where there have been 24 million in the 1820s. Why? Why did they just collapse from 1872 to 1882? Well, of course, we know the story of the bison hunters, the Great Hunt, they call it. These white buffalo hunters going out there and slaughtering them by the millions. But why are they doing it? Why did they suddenly start in 1872? And the reason is factories. Factories. Just as factories needed wood of the old economy, factories needed leather. We didn't yet have these synthetic materials to make the gaskets and the belts and so forth. You need leather. In 1872, we were running out. Most of it had come from cattle in Argentina. But by 1872, the cattle were about all used up. So in that year, a couple of enterprising fellows sent bison hides back east to Pennsylvania and to Germany to say, can you use these? And the word came back, yeah, it worked just fine. So suddenly, the demand for buffalo skin, hides, shot up through the roof. And because of that, of course, Adam Smith's invisible hand, is the demand shot up through the roof, the numbers fell off a cliff. So that within 10 years, they were virtually gone. And if you look at these illustrations of how that was going on out west, you see this looks like a factory, right? It's like industrial slaughter. The factories, in effect, are eating the buffaloes. You need leather? We got leather. So it goes on and on and on. All of this was possible also because of another revolution that was going on during these same years, what I call the movement revolution. Between the 1840s and the turn of the century, the movement, the systems, abilities to move people and things, and even just as important, information, rockets ahead. So on the top and most obvious way, of course, is railroads, which begin to expand in the 1840s, just as we're adding country to the west, and rapidly advances over the next few decades. But also maritime traffic. We don't pay enough attention to that. The lower left-hand slide here shows maritime traffic by new technologies, the new propellers for ships, and on the bottom right, the telegraph. All of this, of course, coordinates the movement by railroads and by maritime commerce is facilitated by telegraphs that sort of tie it all together. So there's this revolution in the way things move, which means a revolution in accessibility of these resources from the West. Not only are we finding the resources, we now have the abilities to access them and to take them where we need them. The West, in effect, is born connected. And the West is born, not just born connected, it is born, consequently, modern. Modern. The technologies of extraction in the West, whereas before, earlier frontiers, you sort of throws you back to an earlier stage. This one, you can start from scratch with the most modern technologies because of this revolution. And we can see this all over the place. Interestingly, even in farming, agriculture. Before, of course, on the frontier, a farm was a family, cutting trees, breaking ground with a plow, and going back to the basic level of production, using sort of oxen to plow up the earth. Now, look at farming in California, in the Central Valley during these years. It's all industrial. There was a farm, I call them mega farms. There was a farm in the Central Valley when it came time in the spring to plow the land. They start off with these huge gang plows, right? So these plows, one of these plows with it's like 8 horses, a bunch of men on it, start and plowing the first furrow, going down. They stop at lunch for a break, pick it up again after lunch. At the end of the day, they stop for the day, and the next day they turn the plow around and begin plowing the second furrow. 17-mile-long furrows in these farms. And how's it processed? Railroad, the telegraph, industrial methods. It's industrial agriculture, and you see it elsewhere in the West. So the cover of the book, these are called bonanza farms. They're up in the northern plains. This is in North Dakota. Gang labor, immigrant labor, railroads, new technologies. This is as much a factory as one producing glass in Maine or textiles in the Carolinas. This is American industry, but it's in the West, and it's with farming. So we see here is that if you look at that first question, how is the modern America different? Well, the modern America is an industrial superpower. It starts as much here as it does anyplace else. And we've got to bring this into the story if we're going to understand the whole story. What else? What else is on the list? Well, the United States is today, again, without debate, the scientific superpower of the world today. I went back, I can't remember the numbers now, went back and asked the question, okay, Nobel Prize winners in scientific fields, right? Where do they come from? Where do they come from? Different nations. The United States produced as many Nobel laureates as the next nine nations together. Now, a lot of those individuals are from elsewhere, but they come to the United States. They come here for Bell Labs. They come here for Caltech. They come here for MIT. We are the scientific superpower of the world. How did that happen? And is the West at all any part of that great change? Well, yeah, as it turns out. What I've discovered, one of the things, probably the most interesting point I discovered in researching this book is that the United States during these years, from 1850 to 1900, 1880, 1900, was, in the eyes of the people then, without a doubt, the great scientific laboratory on Earth. And you see it in field after field after field after field after field. Geology, without question. The great breakthroughs in historic and systematic geology are in the West. People like John Wesley Powell and others. Believe it or not, meteorology, which is basically a new science during that time. The great discoveries are made by studying Western weather, mainly, of course, to help people developing and settling out there. And that's true of epidemiology, if you could believe that. One of the two great breakthroughs in understanding how diseases are transmitted are connected directly to, of all things, Texas cattle drives. In the study of a problem developing among Texas cattle driven northward, they discovered a way that helped us understand the transmission of malaria, bubonic plague, of any variety of diseases. It came out of the West. Well, you could go on, but what I'd like to do today is to concentrate on one particular area of science that was extremely active back then and extremely consequential, and that is paleontology, bone hunting, they call it. People who are investigating and extracting fossilized remains of ancient creatures and trying to categorize them and trying to understand what this means. This was far and away the most active area for this very influential and important science and its breakthroughs during this period. These two guys are most associated with it. Now, they were Easterners. Othniel C. Marsh, not a great name. Nobody names their son, names him Othniel anymore. Othniel of our O.C. Marsh, he was a professor at Yale. Edward Cope, he was comes from a very wealthy Philadelphia family, a Quaker, and he's sort of a privately funded paleontologist. Now, these two guys were engaged in a absolutely ferocious competition. It was just, this is front page news, how these guys are going at each other. And they are really nasty to each other. It's a fascinating story. Michael Crichton has a novel, one of his novels, based on the bone wars between these two guys. So they were the superstars. But what's fascinating, when you get into it, what's really interesting is that so much of the work and discoveries are made by ordinary Westerners, just guys out there. Right? One example, Bill Reed. Bill Reed was a meat hunter for the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad. He would go out and hunt bison and hunt elk and so forth to feed the workers. But he was also a self-trained paleontologist. And he and another guy who ran one of the stations there discovered what they correctly identified as a bone of one of these ancient dinosaurs. And they sent a telegram back to Marsh saying that they had found this thing and they were willing to help him, as long as, of course, as Marsh came across with some money. They sent it back with pseudonyms. They didn't want him to get the jump on them. And he said, great. So Reed became the chief field man for Marsh and work in Nebraska with the Como fossil beds, which are the biggest ones at the time. He found and extracted the remains of the Diplodocus carnegii. This is in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. Have you ever seen this? This thing that kids can gawk at. He found this, did this until he stopped and went back to work as a sheepherder. Charles Sternberg, another example of this. He came out as a kid, a teenager, from Ohio, out to Kansas to Fort Larned, way out there in western Kansas. His brother, George, was the post surgeon, the top doctor out there. And he had some land, so he invited his younger brother out there to help him on the land. And he came out, and he became absolutely fascinated, as he did his work out there with his cattle, fascinated by these fossilized plant remains he found. Fossilized magnolia leaves from back when this was the edge of a huge shallow lake, where Kansas is now. And he then went on to have this distinguished career in paleontology, and it's not just not paleobotany, but paleontology of animal remains. He became a close collaborator with Cope, and himself a major figure in the field. He found fossils like this, the Triceratops. This is in the London Museum of Natural History. Well, okay. Why was it such a deal? Why was there such fascination and activity in paleontology? Because, of course, it touched directly on the most controversial idea, position of that entire second half of the century. And that is, of course, evolution. Darwin's ideas of evolution by natural selection. So Darwin's ideas, this is a very familiar portrait of it, the tree of life, that over unimaginably long periods of time, that every living creature today, every living organism today was descended from earlier forms. And the critics, and they're still around, the critics said, that's interesting. Prove it. Great idea. You'll sit around and jaw about it, but how do you know? How do you know? Prove it. So Marsh set out to do that. One of the claims of Darwin, for example, was you take any particular animal today, and you should be able to, if you go through the fossil beds, you should be able to find the fossils that'll sort of fit these together into a chain, links of a chain, that'll produce this animal. Nobody had done it. So Marsh, here he is, top center there, tried to look very Western. Those are all Yale grad students, incidentally. You can aspire to that out there. He set out to do it. And he did it through the horse. Over an extensive period of time. He and these students and these Westerners found the fossilized remains focusing on horse toes that became hooves. And they showed, in the eyes of most scientists, irrefutably, that this was one of those chains. Starting with Hyracotherium, down here at the bottom, about the size of a collie, 50 million years ago, up through the modern horse, Equus caballos. Okay. Darwin also claimed that if you go over to the right side of the tree of life here, the left, look at the top left, you see the horse, or the right side, he also claimed that if you take any particular species and you trace it back, you'll see that it comes from this astonishing variety of animals that you wouldn't associate with them, right? In this case, if you look over the upper right up there, you'll see birds and then you trace them back, and you see dinosaurs, and you see reptiles. He says, Darwin said, in my opinion, that's the lineage that you're going to find. And the critics, of course, said, show me. So Marsh did. 1880, Marsh produced Odontornithes, which was, okay? Can you hear it? Is that better? Okay, thank you. What he did in this publication, government publication, which came out of a Western exploration. Thank you, Jay. What he did was to go back, to look back to this earlier period, fossilized birds that came out of the chalk beds of Kansas, western Kansas. And these birds, these fossils showed, what was the time considered irrefutable, affinities to the fossils of reptiles at the time. Bones, bird bones. These were similar bird bones, but were similar also to early reptile bones. But the real kicker here, was he found these birds. This is about a 6-foot long, sort of penguin-like bird that would swim through the oceans, gobbling up fish. Hesperornis regalis. This was a bird with teeth, a toothed bird. And reptiles, of course, have teeth. Birds don't, so they sort of diverge there. But this seemed to be pretty convincing evidence that, in fact, both birds and modern reptiles, like snakes and crocodiles and so forth, came from a common beginning. He called this bird, Hesperornis regalis, the royal bird of the West, appropriately enough. Well, these were huge breakthroughs in the confirmation of Darwin's theories, and they were recognized most of all by Darwin. When Marsh sent a copy of this publication, Odontornithes, to Darwin, he read it and immediately sent a letter back to Marsh, and he said, this is the greatest, the most important confirmation of my ideas in the last 20 years. And this was published in 1880, so take 20 years back. He's saying since the publication of The Origin of Species, which was 1859. So regardless of, and of course the debate around evolution still goes on, of course, but I think you have to recognize that in the world of science, the attention focused on the West was absolutely brilliant. And you can find this in other fields, geology, all the rest of them that I mentioned. So was the West partly responsible for the creation of the modern nation as this scientific superpower? I think absolutely, yes. And we can't understand how that happened unless we go back and take this continental approach to it. Third, what else can you say about modern America? Well, modern America, compared to the United States of 1850s, 1840s, 1850s, has a far greater, wider embrace of different peoples as part of our citizenship than before. What you see from 1850 on is this rapid expansion of what it means to be in the American family. Right? When you say that, look at that, the first thing you think of course, is emancipation. At the end of the Civil War, the freeing of enslaved peoples, about 4 million persons defined as property before suddenly are recognized as members of the American family and citizens, and soon enough as voters. Huge change. But that was just one of the things that were going on here. What if we look to the West? What do we see? Well, in this expansion out to the Pacific, look what's going on. Some kind of Mexican cession. We are extending our borders, our boundaries, around dozens of native peoples, dozens of tribes, different tribes. And the American formal policy from the start is that these native peoples will become, at some point, they will become citizens of the United States. We will expand our embrace not only to the freed people, but also to native peoples. It was done here's California. These are all distinct tribes with different languages. If you remember back to that first early slide that I showed you of the American 1846, this is what we're talking about. How in the world are you going to bring that range of people and cultures into American society? How do you do that? The government's answer was reservations. Put them on reservations. Now let me say very quickly, there's a lot to criticize reservations about. There were a lot of awful things that happened on reservations. But what I'm asking you to do right now is to remember why they were created. And this is the formal policy of the United States. Why were they created? They were created as kind of these social and cultural laboratories to bring Indian peoples into the mainstream. The idea was that we'll use these, we'll put them on here, we will transform them into American citizens, farming, we'll educate their kids, and we'll do all that, and then the reservations will dissolve, and there'll be no distinction. Now that was the formal policy. That is not at all necessarily what happened on the reservations, but that was the goal. That's what they said they were trying to do, right? So they were trying to, just as we are bringing freed people into a larger American society, we are setting in motion this process of bringing these scores of Indian peoples into the American family. And we're doing it. What's fascinating to me, the government's its plans, its policy, its process of doing that for Indians is essentially the same thing that it's doing for freed people, for the newly freed slaves. Here's one way you can do that. They were called presidential peace medals in the 19th century. These were medals that the government gave to friendly Indian leaders. On one side of each medal was a profile of the president at the time. This is from 1861. On the other side, these medals would show the government's vision for Indian peoples. Go back to Jefferson. You see Jefferson on one side. On the verso, you'll see trade. That was the goal under Jefferson. To bring Indian peoples into the American way of life through economic contact, commerce. What is it for Lincoln? What has the goal become by 1861? Here's the other side. This guy in the headdress behind a plow will make them farmers. Straight up the middle, a church will make them Christians. And to the left of that, on the far left, schoolhouses. We'll educate their children, and as part of that, of course, we will turn the children, the next generation, into American citizens. Same thing that was going on, of course, in the South. 40 acres and a mule, give them land. Freedmen bureaus, schools, and all of this was propelled by evangelical Christianity in the South. If you study that at all, so we're using the same process for freed people and for Indian peoples. The big difference, of course, is that the freed people say, "Great, yeah, we want to be farmers. We've been farming your land for 250 years." School? Absolutely. Please send our kids to school. Teach them how to read and write. Number 3, Christianity. We're already Christians. Slaves were Christianized already. So you go to the left-hand side of the map, and Indian leaders, many of them, said, well, you know what? We got an economy that works really well. Sorry. We educate our children. We can do that. Christian, we got our religion. We're fine. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Let's do lunch. That kind of thing. But of course, then the government said, you don't get it. This is not an offer. This is an order. You will become American citizens, like it or not. e pluribus unum from any one. They're saying you must give up your pluribus and become unum. And that's the ugly side of this, and it's emphasized by the fact that all of this, East and West, the expansion of citizenship to free people, the attempted expansion of citizenship to Indian peoples, always drew fierce resistance. It did not go easily into the people who were living in the South and in the West. In the South, of course, the brutality against African Americans after the end of Reconstruction, after 1877-80. You know, they're put back into their place, supposed place, intimidated, murdered to reestablish the old order. It's only over the next 100 years and more that things improve. How about in the West? A lot of Westerners said, no, we want the land. We want those resources that they're living on top of. So extreme examples of it, like in California, which is clearly genocide. The term is thrown around easily enough, but there's no question that in California you see attempted genocide of Indian peoples with the dramatic collapse of population. 150,000 to about 16,000, 90% drop in population over about 50 years. You see the same thing going on, something similar going on with Hispanos, who are brought in, of course, with the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo. And they are marginalized by violence in other ways, marginalized, pushed to the edges to allow the use of those resources, the access to those resources by American people, by white Americans. You can see this in some interesting figures. We all are aware, of course, of the atrocities against African Americans in between 1880 and the 1930s, these mass lynchings in the South. It's an American horror story. What if you ask the same questions about Hispanics in the West, specifically Southern California, where the most of them were, the Southwest? What do you see? We're just beginning to research this. So it hasn't been done on nearly the scale that you see in the East with black people. But here's the preliminary numbers here. If you look in Mississippi, where the worst of it happened in the East, 1880 to the 1930s, the rate of lynching, this is number of lynchings per 100,000 persons, 53. If you look at the numbers in the West, and ask the same questions, how many Hispanos were lynched during the earlier period, 48 to 79, per 100,000? What's the number? 473, multiple times that. So the point here, of course, is it's not a race, it's not a competition. The point here is that as America expanded geographically, and in this case, as America expanded its ideas of citizenship, that was resisted in various ways. It becomes a very violent, bloody story, but it's a story that goes from coast to coast. In this case, it's a story that begins in the West. It begins with expansion. By 1880 in the West, 79, that new racial order is in place. You don't need to lynch as much. It's just at that point, it begins in the East. And it runs into the 1930s. It's an ugly chapter, but we got to look at it. And again, the point is, it's a story that is both East and West, that is truly continental in its scale. And it's the uglier side in this positive story of expanding our embrace of various peoples in our history. Chinese, of course, you can throw them in. Chinese in the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1887. The only example, the only case in American history when a people are denied entry into the United States strictly, explicitly on the basis of their ethnicity. Where does it happen? It's in the West. So, the point here is that if we acknowledge that these years see this great transition in from an earlier America into the modern America that we know in the 20th and 21st centuries. How did it happen? And what part is played by the birth of the American West and the things that happened in the American West from 1848 and with expansion and the great coincidence of the gold rush and around 1880? To what extent does that have a role in it? What I'm arguing here is it's a significant role, and it's one that we need to give as much attention to as we give to the American Civil War, the other event that unquestionably was critical in this transformation. It's two of them together. And we won't get the story, we won't understand it, unless we see them continually interacting. Thanks very much. You got time for some questions?
You repeat the questions.
Pardon me?
Will you repeat
Of course, sure. Any questions? Yes. Hey, Brian.
So can you describe for us just the genesis of this book, how it came to be, conceptualization of the book?
I'm sorry. I'm
How did you
deficit
conceive
stump.
of this book? How did it come to be?
Oh, how did it come to be? How did I come up with the book? Well, it's part of a series, University of Nebraska, The History of the West. Dick Edeling is the general editor of it, and he asked me to do it. I said, sure, that sounds good, sounds fun. So that's where it came from, but then it became much more than that over time. Dick Edeling is a superhumanly patient person, and it just took many, many years, as I said before. I also, the original contract purpose was from 1865 to 1900. But the more I got into that, I said, that makes no sense whatsoever. The change didn't start in 1865. It starts in 1848, right? And so we need to look at this from 1848, 50, up until the traditional end of Reconstruction, 1877, 1880. Dick was a little alarmed at that, but came around. So anyway, it started with the simple question: Can you tell us the story of the creation of West from the Civil War into the Civil War at the turn of the century? And it became something to me much more interesting, much more revealing, and much harder to research and write. But you're also shy. Yes.
You may have been surprised, like we were, at how many Latino lynchings there were in some of those years. Were there other things that surprised you that were quite new to the concept of looking at the history of the West?
About that particular question of violence and so forth, or just anything? Oh, so much.
Feel in a new way.
Oh gosh, so much. One of the things I focused on was science. I knew that there were geologists running around out there. What I did not know is that this was the place. This was the great laboratory of worldwide science during a period of some of its greatest breakthroughs in the history of science. And the West was squarely part of it. Many Western historians and Western students out there. When have you ever seen that? Are there any texts of Western history that talk about that at all, or at least let you know how important it was? That was one thing. The other, environmental consequences. Now, I did know about that. One of my fields is environmental history. But what I hadn't really grasped was how, I think arguably, there's no period in the history of the world when you see that big a place going through that many environmental convulsions and changes with that variety of consequences. In effect, the American West, as it's being born, is being remade environmentally. Entirely different place. Yeah. Animals, plants, microbes, all of that. It's simply utterly transformed. I'm not a world historian, but I've asked people, I can't think of another case in world history where you see that scope of change. Dan Flores, who's a wonderful historian, now retired. Dan has a recent book called A Wild New World, and he argues convincingly that if we're looking simply at the slaughter of animals, that there's nothing in world history that approaches what happens. Not just obvious ones like the bison, but others as well. It's this mass, not extinction, but this mass decimation of wildlife. But that, of course, is tied up with floral changes, and so much of the rest. So those are just a couple of examples. There was just so much more. It's such a revelation when you look at this story. So much that we don't recognize in the usual course of American history. That I think we've got to take a look at. Yes, sir.
You were talking about these twin relationships. Could you expand a little bit on the relationship of the Civil War on the West?
The Civil War on the West.
Civil War in the West. Oh, thank you. Well, it depends on how you define the Civil War. If by the Civil War you mean the usual narrow way of looking at it, that is the military conflict between the Confederacy and the Union to decide whether or not the Confederacy can secede. The question of whether the old republic will remain intact. If that's the question, the West plays, it's a footnote, if that, very minor role in that. There's this early attempt by the Confederacy to invade the West through New Mexico, to seize New Mexico and the Colorado gold mines, and from there to expand and to grab the whole rest. It's a great vision of Jefferson Davis and others. In my opinion, and I argue this in the book, it never had a chance. Never had a chance. And it went nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. So the Civil War, the military aspect of the Civil War in the West, well, it was over in about 20 minutes. Poof. And that has led certainly many scholars to sort of dismiss the West in the history of the Civil War. What I argue in this book is that we should expand what we mean by the Civil War. Make it the Civil War era, if you want to do that, which we usually define as 1850 to 1877. Civil War era, look at it that way, then the West plays a critical part in all of this. It's during that period that, to put it succinctly, what happens in the Civil War era is that the older republic is saved and preserved. But also, the expanded republic, the new nation, is integrated into the nation, is secured in the nation. So at the end of this process, both East and West, this continental nation has been created. East and West. East is saved and the West is created. But the result is the same one nation. Now, I try to figure out ways to use another term except the Civil War, and I think that's, you're you're wrestling with impossibility. You can't do that. Because the problem is, of course, if you say Civil War, you think of Gettysburg, right? You think of Shiloh, you think of Antietam and the rest of it. What I'm saying here is you've got to think of that. You've got to think of military actions out in the West against Indian peoples, for example, the securing of resources in the West, the securing of transit routes around the West, the protection of resources, the creation of political units. Yeah, something like, what is it? 2 states and several territories are created in 4 years. There's no period in American history when there was greater political organization, including after 1815, after the War of 1812. So there's this huge political event out there that integrates the West into the nation. If you think of the longer stretch of those years as the Civil War years, then the West plays an absolutely critical role in this. Yes, sir.
Some of us are descendants of pioneers and pilgrims and immigrants coming here into Utah and various areas. What is the role of religion in the expansion of the West?
That's another one that again, found very illuminating. The question here is, what was the role of religion in the creation of the American West and the events during that period? Well, of course, the great example, of course, is that of Latter-day Saints. Increasing the role of religion in creating this particular society out here, but also in another thing that I found kind of astonishing. When you think of the question, let's say in 1870, where in the United States would you go to find the highest percentage of foreign-born persons in a particular state, this or that? And our immediate instinct, of course, is to say Atlantic coast. It's the Lower East Side, Manhattan. It's New York. It's Boston, and so forth. Well, go to the census and ask that question. 1870 census. Not numbers, of course. A lot more immigrants in the East in numbers, but in terms of percentage of the society. What percentage of a given state or territory was born outside the United States? Tom? Probably? Utah's close. they're really up there. But look at it, and then list them. New York, with 25%, the one that we normally think of, was 10th. The first 9 were in the West. Utah was right up there. Arizona, Idaho, Montana, Utah, those, had close to half of the people, every other person you would find in these states and territories had been born someplace else. The West was the most cosmopolitan, polyglot part of the United States, and it would remain so. I just learned from talking with Jay before the talk here. Peruvian sheep herders in Utah. Who knew? That's true, and that's true today. But you could follow that back to the very beginning. I actually found. I'll begin one of these chapters saying that the 1870 census showed, according to the 1870 census, fully 2/3 of all Greenlanders in the United States in 1870 were in the West. One was in California, one was in Kansas, the third was in Pennsylvania. So of the 3 Greenlanders, right? 2 of them were out here. And that's sort of a microcosm of this whole thing. And certainly, getting away from the question, but certainly, the Mormon Church, LDS, was critical of that. You all know that, of course. But you find it elsewhere. Religion in other ways. Christian reformist societies in the West, encouraging people to come here. Jews in the West, Judaism. There's this rich history of Jews in the American West. There are not a lot of them in numbers, but they play absolutely central roles in many areas, politics and in economics. And the story behind that is fascinating, because there are established Jewish organizations in the East that are kind of embarrassed by the new Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. And so they create Jewish colonies out of the West that sort of send them out there to become Americans. It's another way of assimilation, another program. I even found, mark this in your notes, I even found in Nebraska a sod synagogue. A synagogue made like a sod house. So yes, absolutely, and that's a. I gave a short presentation back in the Western History Association about 3 areas that we really need to go more into, and that was one of them: science and religion. I said we need to pay more attention, and specifically, I think we need to pay far more attention to what is this new school of historians called lived religion. That is, get away from, don't abandon it, but think more broadly than the history of congregations of particular religion, Methodists in Nebraska or whatever, and go into the documents, everyday documents of people, and ask yourself, what part did religion play in these people's lives? And what you'll see, my early work was in social history, and I read hundreds, of letters and reminiscences and so forth. And you cannot read those documents without coming away knowing that religion was absolutely crucial to these people's lives, regardless of their particular flavor of religion, whatever they were doing. It was just a vital part of their lives. We need to tell the story of what that meant. What did religion mean to these people as they were going through this extraordinary experience?
Let's give one more round of applause to Elliott.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks so much.